Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're just going to wait a few more moments for a few more folks to sign on. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the TBR Webinar series. Today, Director of Tailored Services Bryan Belanger will be discussing separating the tricks from the treats in the emerging technology sector. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screens, you'll see a series of buttons. From left to right, you can access the slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, our survey, and social sharing. After the webinar, you'll receive an email with a replay link, as well as a link to view and register for other TBR webinars. If you have any questions for us, please submit them via the Q&A widget in On24. You may also reach out to us after the event at webinars@tbri.com. Thank you again for joining us, and here's Bryan to begin the webinar.
Great. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining. We'll spare you the Halloween puns from here, but happy Halloween. I know it's trick-or-treat in my town tonight. I know officially it's tomorrow. But being the theme, separating tricks versus treats in the emerging tech sector, I'd be remiss if I didn't say happy Halloween to everyone. As Sarah said, my name's Bryan Belanger. I direct our tailored services practice, which is our side of the business that helps our clients address custom questions that go beyond and deeper than the scope of what we look at in our recurring syndicated research, our industry benchmarks, vendor reports, market forecasts, customer adoption studies. So my goal today really is threefold. It's to weave together some common and high-level themes we're seeing in our recurring research with common questions looking around the corner that we get in our custom research, all around that theme of emerging technology, what's happening, what's myth, what's reality. Our second goal will be to give our recommendations based on advising our clients in our tailored services practice and through our recurring research as to what are the best practices, what are the themes we see that support a successful navigation overall for ICT vendors, products and services around those trends, speaking at common threads and common themes that can support all vendors. And then lastly, provide some more granular recommendations on what we've seen in our work prove particularly successful in navigating that complexity. So where I want to start is kind of to, with that first objective, outline the state of play in the market. And so we'll certainly have you take our word for it and go through a few examples of what we see, but I wanted to pull in an outside source. One of my favorite topics or my favorite pieces of conversation, whether it's talking about a project, having a conversation with a colleague over lunch, is around the idea of buzzwords. Particularly in our space, buzzwords dominate the day. And so I went out and found a recent Trust Radius survey of just under 1,000 software buyers where they asked, what's your most hated, and that's the way they phrased it in the survey, what's your most hated buzzwords? And I was amazed to see that really for us, as well as the clients that we interact with regularly, the major disruptive and transformative technologies that we talk about, that we have reports on, are hated in the industry. And it comes really as, it was kind of jarring to see all in one list like this, but it comes as no surprise because they are pervasive, they are dominant in terms of vendor business strategies. And I think this underlines our conversation because it's critical from concept development and R&D through go-to-market execution and revenue realization, that because these are so pervasive, because these are hated, but they're so critical to vendors' long-term revenue contribution, that they go about approaching these trends in a way that is realistic, that speaks to business model, business value, that leverages research techniques to ensure that when you're messaging the customer, when you're sitting with the customer, you're speaking to what's real versus what's myth or what's not real yet. And that's really the theme of today's conversation, is to explore that through a few of these markets and then give our overarching recommendations to what we've seen in working with vendors side by side in addressing these trends be most successful. So this slide here is really just a summary of a few of the examples that I want to go through in greater detail. I think we saw all of these on that most hated buzzwords list. Quantum computing, 5G, IoT, digital, all interrelated, intertwining themes impact your businesses at some level, are top of mind for your customers at some level. And what we see is that across these themes, there's a separation between what the market is saying, what is being published about these technology trends, and what the reality of the state of adoption is. Here at TBR, we benchmark all these trends in terms of principally vendor strategy, vendor revenue realization, and customer adoption. And so we've provided some examples of relevant TBR research for each of these trends that can be explored and consumed to go even deeper than I will today about exactly what the reality is in each of these markets. But I want to go through each of these technology sectors and provide a high-level view of the separation that we see between the marketing trick and the reality of business model and vendor performance realization in each of these markets. The first I mentioned was quantum computing. There's been recent news that our analysts have tracked around Google and indicating that they've reached quantum supremacy. There's marketing collateral out there from some of the largest vendors in the world that mentions how quantum computing is nearing a phase of commercialization that's going to disrupt business models. And while we believe, and we're firmly rooted, that quantum computing is a critical long-term disruptor in the industry, I think there's a tendency in the market when we're talking about quantum supremacy or about commercialization of quantum computing business model to get out on our skis a little bit in terms of when that's actually going to hit critical mass. The bottom of the slide that you have here is a graphic our quantum analysts, Stephanie Long and Jeff Wollicott, have produced that gives our sense of the life cycle of quantum compute. And really what we're seeing is that it's effectively 2 decades out that quantum tips the scales from being a very expensive on-premises value proposition with specific use cases to achieving a point of tipping the scales into adoption. Current use cases don't really exist. It's very much an R&D proposition, and then commercial viability hits well down the line. So again, a first example of a gap between kind of what is a 20-year product development and incubation life cycle in the market, talking about, as you see in the first quote here, the practical era of quantum computers already beginning. The same dynamic is at play at an albeit different scale in the 5G space. What we see in 5G, I pulled an example from a CNN article in December 2018 saying 5G is here. How can you get it? Speaking very much to the now, the reality of here, this market is here, this capability is here. We've been asked extensively, and we track extensively in our 5G series of reports, both market landscapes and forecasts, as well as custom endeavors on behalf of telecom equipment providers, operators, and other participants in this space. What are the use cases? What is the state of demand in 5G? How do we message that to our clients? And what we see, and it's highlighted here on this slide with some of our views on forecasting CapEx spend around 5G and by use case, is that the majority of spend on 5G infrastructure over the forecast period, which is out to 2023 in our research, will be directly tied to traditional network use cases. So it's very much in kind of close to home update migration mode, moving forward through the forecast period with other those highly promised use cases coming to fruition only later in the forecast period. It is here in some sense, but it's not as holistically here as presented in the messaging around the capability. And there's also overarching dark clouds that may impact the nature of the market. These are things we're writing on extensively and advising vendors on extensively in the 5G space. A major one is private 5G and what enterprise strategy ultimately becomes around private 5G and whether the deployment approach that's used, not going for an operator 5G network slice, building a fully private on-premises deployment may impact the opportunity for use cases in sectors like manufacturing, logistics, and warehousing, and dampen the overall market outlook for 5G, and of course, the pervasive threat and potential stifling that could occur due to policies around spectrum zoning, permitting, security, data usage, and other factors. So again, an area where 5G is highly buzzed. There's many stories coming out in the market about it, but our view is that vendors need to navigate these and consider these dark clouds and think about the realities of use cases that are going to materialize to revenue. Another area that's reported on in greater depth in our 5G research as well. We see similar dynamics at play in the IoT world. A recent article early this year that was looking at essentially aggregating a bunch of different IoT market forecasts that are out there, many of which look at device in unit counts in IoT. That article encapsulated the market as IoT device proliferation isn't just going to grow, it's going to explode throughout the course of 2019. And they're basically bringing it back to acknowledging IoT as a buzzword, but also noting the significant and vast, explosive is the term they use it, growth that's going to occur around IoT, both from a device perspective, a service perspective, and an application opportunity perspective. And while we agree, it's captured here, that the IoT market is too big to miss, what we see is that, and this is directly quoted from our IoT research, we don't see it as explosive. We think there's opportunities tied to specific verticals. There's a revenue growth outlook that's in the low double digits as we benchmarked in recent quarters. But there's overarching factors around deal sizing, deal opportunity, adoption effectiveness that will impact the market for IoT. So it's looking beyond purely to the device counts and the messaging that's out there in the market to where is vendors actually recording revenue that's related to IoT. And then the last example, which I think kind of is the buzzword of the hour and encapsulates a lot of these topics, is the idea of digital transformation. And I think we've all seen or heard digital transformation being talked about in different formats, referencing different things. But I'll bring it back to the quote in CEO World magazine in January 2018, which indicated that in 2019, this year, which we're, again, on the doorstep of Halloween and heading towards Thanksgiving, if you aren't leading digital transformation charge, you will fail. Your digital disruptor will steal your customers. Messaging directly to the large IT products and services vendor, if you aren't leading that charge, you're going to fail. And while there's a message in there that I think is real in terms of the ability to pivot business to accommodate in an effective and realistic way these overarching IT product and services trends and customer adoption trends, the reality that we see in the market is a little bit different than what's stated out there around the state of digital transformation. So the graphic you have here on this slide comes from customer adoption research that we do on a recurrent basis around digital transformation. We ask respondents in that research to self-identify into 4 categories based on the state of their digital transformation. The green bars or the green outline bars you see here represent the number of respondents that have identified into a given category that are actively taking major investments to pursue a digital transformation agenda. And what we've seen overall is that the total percentage of respondents that are engaged in a transformation effort, regardless of phase, has declined compared to the previous survey. Our analysts see things like ROI roadblocks, business process changes, reorganizations, challenges with data integration and management that are having enterprises step back, not necessarily move away from a digital transformation initiative, but trying to find ways to optimize, to do it better. This is also reflected in additional research, which is available in that digital transformation reporting, which looks at vendor revenues. You'll see that despite this market messaging that digital transformation is here and you'll fail, the largest IT services providers that we track in that research are generating the vast majority of their revenue from traditional IT services. Digital revenues are growing. Revenues in other areas such as cloud professional services are growing steadily, but a lot of the investment, if you follow the dollar in the market, a lot of the activity is around the core business as enterprises work through what we've just said on this slide, those roadblocks around data integration and other factors that set them up for long-term transformation success. So while it's true that pursuing and supporting digital transformation is critical, the marketing trick of it being a failure point in 2019 is really not the case if you follow follow the dollar of vendor revenue or what customers are currently telling us about the states of their digital transformation. So we put together a graphic that I think, and this is pivoting kind of to the second part of our conversation around pulling together some of those high-level themes, each of which can be explored with our analysts that can deep dive into greater detail on the tricks versus the treats of each of those particular markets. But we aggregate it into kind of 2 different curves that represent 2 different realities. One is the emerging technology hype curve, that's those marketing tricks we talk about, overinflating and stating levels of growth, when growth is going to occur, when activity is going to occur in the market. And we've overlaid that here against just a general typical product life cycle curve. And we've provided on the bottom of this slide the typical kind of product life cycle stages of an IT product or service. And what we see is that there's that gulf, that gap in the early stages of incubation, when R&D trials are proving successful. There's a lot of initial marketing activity that touts the success of trials that creates a major gap between the hype, the market discussion around a particular technology. That's where that buzzword discontent is really created versus the reality of the product, what it can do, where revenue is being generated, what provable, quantifiable business benefits for the customer it offers. And ultimately, there's an inflection point where that hits reality. Depending on the offering, these curves can flatten or expand. And then there's a period of growth for the offer where messaging might taper off, the market hype might taper off, but it's reaching scale in terms of customer adoption in deployment for achievement of specifically defined, provable use cases. And so really the latter of our conversation is about the best ways we've seen, the common threads, the common activities that we've seen in the market that can help bring these two curves closer together, whether it's sitting with a customer, whether it's in creating the next white paper to message a new offering, whether it's setting up market entry pricing for a new solution. Our recommendations on how to bring these closer to reality, how to be the organization that's telling it like it is in terms of that emerging technology solution. So from the projects we do, and we do about 100 projects a year as a team, plus our recurring research that we do in the market, we bring it back to whether it's 5G, whether it's quantum, whether it's IoT, 5 overarching and interrelated themes that we see as best-in-class practices of vendors that are most effectively incubating, launching, messaging new emerging technology offerings that are proving most successful in the eyes of the customer or most aligned to expectations of the customer versus the reality of the actual deployment. And so I think this permeates our thinking, our coverage, but focusing on the business of technology. The technology itself is not the solution. The technology is a lever and a tool to achieve a business outcome. And that's where defining use cases, having clear roadmaps into how the technology supports and facilitates business problem, making sure commercial and pricing models reflect that is absolutely critical, particularly in these areas, to get the business case out in front of the messaging early for something like quantum or blockchain. Knowing your audience. I think this is another major factor, is that often with an emerging technology, there's a one-size-fits-all approach to market messaging around that technology or targeting of the solution, but extending that to the next level of depth in terms of creating outbound white papers or thinking through the offering in terms of specifically defined personas that are going to consume that offering is absolutely critical to adoption. I'll give you an example from a recent engagement that we supported on a custom basis, which was looking at IP assets that are offered by vendors in implementation of a major software package. So what systems integrators are bringing to the table to help support successful delivery of that solution. Now, while not an emerging area, the idea of having those repeatable accelerators to support delivery is something that's emerging, growing. And what we heard from customers in that research is that the message was often the same in terms of, particularly in that area, there was a strong alignment to business value, business outcome messaging. So they checked that box, but the messaging was not tailored to the audience in the room. It resonated well with the C-suite making the decision, but the folks that were going to be leading the IT program management and governance to support that deployment could see through the messaging and understand that the technology that was messaged was really just kind of vendor slideware and not something that was going to support the actual delivery implementation of the project in a way that was going to save time and effort. So that comes back to knowing your audience and being able to message to different stakeholder groups, whether externally, outbound, on a broad basis, or in that pitch for the offering directly. Embracing the limitations. I think This is a really big one that we've heard regularly, is that customers that we interview, and we do about 1,500 plus CIO level interviews per year, they can see through, using my past example, what's a vendor that's coming in saying, sure, we can do everything for you, versus someone who embraces the limitations of what they do and don't do well in an emerging technology area, and is willing to bring and knit together an integrated ecosystem of partners to support the solution. To give you another example there, in the security space, we've done recent research where one of the hypotheses we had in doing that research was that any vendor that can do end-to-end professional services in security, from strategy advisory, supporting risk assessments at the board level, through to back-end managed services, is going to resonate with the customer, provide a single point of contact, simplify the engagement architecture. We heard from CISOs that they really don't want, they want to diversify their risk across multiple providers. They want to think about how they save budget in specific areas that are more commodity or more competitive than others. And so what we found is that messaging of we can do everything in that area didn't really resonate at a practical level in terms of capability. Customers don't believe that to be the case, and they also don't want to pay for that value proposition. So just another example, but again, embracing the limitations. Making it real for customers, moving beyond what's just a nice PowerPoint pitch or a nice messaging piece with little action behind it, to ensuring that there's a demo behind each and every offering or customer conversation, or providing real case studies and examples, quantifying through research the value of a specific case study, or allowing a customer to understand what the specific opportunity might be for them around a particular use case for an emerging technology. And then considering all angles of research that can inform and support incubation of that new offering. We tend to see, you saw it reflected in some of the marketing tricks examples that I shared, is that there tends to be in these areas a focus on that big market size number. What's the total aggregate or total addressable market rather? What's the aggregate device growth that we're seeing in IoT? What's the size of the 5G market going to be by 2023? Not necessarily breaking that down to what does that mean for me, Mr. Vendor, in terms of making revenue? What use cases is that going to apply to? Where are customers actually going to spend on what types of products and services? So doing that next level is something that we find successful as well. And what we see, and this is a slide that is really kind of aggregating a lot of themes from a lot of different of the emerging technology areas and others that I haven't even spoken to into common themes. The question becomes, okay, what does an offering look like? What does a strategy look like that is taking into account those 5 points that TBR thinks are most valuable, most instructive in pursuing an incubation of emerging technology? What's the right way to go through this? And the short answer is that it's different for every technology, every vendor case, and that's frankly why we're asked to go out and do these types of projects. But we do see some common themes across industry that we wanted to share. And these go back to, again, the business model of the emerging technology. From a portfolio perspective, themes we've heard regularly, whether it's in digital transformation, IoT, services-led orientation, limited to no customization of the technology. Customers want standard, whether it's replatforming an existing technology, moving to version 2.0 of their ERP, or deploying an IoT application. Want standardization. They don't want complexity. They want services to effectively deploy and build a business case and support the change management around that technology, but not necessarily to customize in a way that's going to create burden in terms of internal management and cost as well. The ability to choose from a la carte in an as-a-service consumption model consumable bundles aligned to different customer journeys, different customer sizing. That common themes we've heard for years, we've looked at for years. They apply differently to different areas, but something that we continually see emerging as themes across technologies. For one example is we supported an IoT platform vendor recently with how they might architecture their portfolio to resonate with customers. And we looked at 5 or 7 different competitors, and what we saw is that really all the competitors were kind of structuring their IoT platform offerings in an a la carte manner, but with kind of roadmap bundles, kind of good, better, best, or bronze, silver, gold packages that could help simplify the consumption process, simplify the contractual process, the metering for customers. Whereas the vendor that we were working with, who had built their IoT assets ground up, we're selling them purely kind of as one-offs. There was no recommended architecture or packaging. It was very technical in terms of how they were structuring both the pricing model and the packaging for things like predictive analytics and the other components of that platform. It made it very complex for the customer to understand what and at what level they needed to buy things. So common theme we see. That bleeds into commercial and pricing that I have here as well, which is along with those changes in packaging, simplified commercial terms, flexibility on commercial terms, shorter engagements, more metering flexibility, and reduction in number and complexity of pricing terms, aligning the pricing models closer to outcome. And then lastly, go-to-market and messaging. This has probably been one of the bigger areas of question that we've seen over the year around the emerging technology areas that we've been asked about. The outcome is those vendors that are embracing ecosystem and consortium-led go-to-market, acknowledging and embracing the limitations, as I mentioned on the previous slide, of their own capabilities, and then targeting specific buyer personas, understanding who buys, why, and targeting them with their messaging is critical. And then lastly here, one of the objectives of this session was to talk about messaging. So I think we've heard in almost every study we've done this year that the importance of demo as in terms of making it real, the importance of case studies, social proof, personalization of messaging of the emerging technology into what it means for my business. All absolutely critical areas, customer pain points that they've identified that not necessarily being achieved by current offerings. And then what we've heard is in the course of an emerging technology deployment from those customers that have actually embarked on a project is to continually make it real through an agile delivery methodology that is supported by assets and an approach that allows you to see the technology being deployed and used in real time, work around workshops with working data over the course of the project, whether it's a core deployment or an emerging technology. That's that idea of making it real from the selling process through the delivery process. That's a real pain point and a real driver for customers. So continuing that conversation further, as a group that executes projects to help customers and to embark on setting up pricing, setting up portfolio for an emerging offering, we're having conversations about what the right way is to do that, and what our customers who are your peers are thinking about as far as how they do that effectively. And to summarize, we think it comes down to 4 areas that organizations need to look at. Technology viability, which is that idea of quantum supremacy as put forth by Google. Is the technology ready? Are there commercial applications of this technology? Is it reliable? Do we have proven trials or field tests? Has it been brought to a cost level, in a deployment level, where it can be implemented in a business reality in terms of costs and time to implement from a vendor perspective? And this is something that we have a webinar coming up that will look at the state of digital transformation in much greater detail than I've spoken to by our practice lead, Patrick Heffernan, And he wants to explore and will explore and has been exploring the idea of vendor readiness, which is, do we have the right resources and teams in place to support implementation of this technology? Are we culturally ready as an organization to deliver on the technology capability we've created? Do we need to hire people? Do we as the vendor need to train people? Is our leadership able to architect a vision through delivery of this technology? From the customer side, similar questions. Is there a customer base, a persona, a type of enterprise that will consume the technology? Is there an addressable market overall? And what does that look like? How will they want to pay and consume that technology? And then lastly, it's about the competitive landscape. What are our peers and broader peer landscape doing in this market? How competitive is it? Are they likely to enter if they haven't already? So we think these 4 interlocking levers are the ways or the kind of tools at the disposal of the vendor in terms of effective evaluation, implementation of an emerging technology strategy, from market messaging, the possible, to actually creating a pricing and commercial strategy, setting up a sales organizational structure, incentives, partner programs to go out and pursue the opportunity. And one thing I think that I've had a lot of recent conversations about and that we come back to is kind of the perception of where competitive tracking fits into this paradigm. Often we hear our competitors aren't really relevant in quantum computing or in IoT. We want to make that market. We don't care about what our legacy peers are doing. We don't care about what the competition is doing. We have a unique point of view on this market. Competitors may be doing something, but we're at scale in terms of what we're able to do. Our view of reality, having done many of these types of projects and being vendor-centric in how we look at the world, is that first and foremost, the definition of competitor expands broadly. So it's not only about looking at what our 3, 5, 7 core competitors are doing, but it's scanning the market regularly for new competitors that are fast followers or likely to be our new competitors as we enter the market. From a customer point of view, it may not be clear that differentiation that you as the vendor see in what we're doing versus our competition is doing is real. Customers may not differentiate. They may feel that they could go to you versus your direct competitors to consume that emerging technology solution. Competitors may be doing things, as I mentioned, around vendor readiness, around leadership, changes in culture, training that are not visible to the market, have not been messaged to the market, but are mobilization efforts around the emerging technology to accelerate into that space. So we think that the competitive component of evaluating emerging technology is something that we're asked about, but probably not at the scale that would be valuable to go out and assess these markets for these common reasons or objectives that we hear. But we see broad applicability of competitor input across multiple areas, whether it's around those other core areas that we identified as critical to emerging technology incubation before, whether it's technology viability and looking at competitive features, or vendor readiness and benchmarking those behind-the-scenes actions of competitors in terms of how they're re-architecting sales compensation models, or what they're doing to change culture or leadership to support emerging technology growth. And then lastly, how are they thinking about customer in terms of what personas, what segmentation, what size, what industry verticals for these areas as well. So the key message here is that as we embrace and embark on figuring out what's real and what's myth in these emerging technology areas, we think that the competitive area and deep diving on competitors is absolutely critical, with an acknowledgement that competitor might not be who it was yesterday. And so I think there's 2 dimensions to that we'd advise as kind of best practice and are things we're trying to infuse into our coverage, whether it's of quantum, IoT, digital, 5G, AI or PC as a service or whatever emerging technology, product, or service concept we're speaking to. In the first, and I think core and native to what we believe in as far as looking at IT markets, is following the dollar. So developing robust, competitive line of business financial models in an emerging technology area, customized and structured around a set of apples-to-apples comparisons that can provide a fact-based, updated, recurrent view of what's actually going on and where vendors are making money and profit in an emerging technology area. Again, we think a lot of those objections around our competitors aren't in this space or our competitors aren't doing anything, that can be explored, vetted, and validated by making sure that as soon as a market is conceptualized, there's a financial model that not only looks at what's the overall opportunity size in architecture that's addressable in this market, but are competitors making money from it? Is it in product or service? What services segments? What size of customers? And what's the contextual kind of trend line around that? I think always bringing it back to the dollar and where it's going in the market, whether it's direct or adjacent competitors, is an absolutely critical way to get arms around an emerging technology. It helps identify the revenue and the profitability pools. It's likely that IT vendors of a certain size and orientation are going through the same trends, facing the same headwinds, and so there's a lot to be gleaned in terms of where competitors are or aren't making their hay in these areas. And even if it's a market that's as nascent as quantum compute, understanding if there's any exploratory dollars going out for consulting engagements from the SIs, or similarly with something like 3D printing, are they seeing any revenue as they build practices in that is a first step in understanding what the opportunity may be and where the dollars are going. And then supplementing that with a view of what the commercial structures and models are that are being used to deploy that opportunity is hand in hand absolutely critical. I think this is where we as a tailored research team get most of our questions is in, we've identified an emerging technology area, we have a capability, we have a portfolio concept in place, but we really don't understand both how other competitors are charging and pricing for this, or what customers are willing to pay, how they want to pay. So we've done a number of engagements around emerging technology areas. I mentioned IoT is one, where we'll be engaging to understand, do customers want those 3 to 5 vendors? Are they okay with one end-to-end provider? What are they willing to pay for those types of services? And then taking this one step further too and looking at competitive organizational structures, cultures, delivery processes, leadership changes. That kind of tracking when deployed on a quarterly basis or even a monthly basis in these emerging technology areas can provide deep insight on the right way to build a business around these emerging technologies. It's the nature of the majority of questions that we get as a team is what are our peers doing? What can we learn from the market as we try and conceptualize and commercialize a business around these areas? So bringing it back to our overall goal today, we explored some themes around where we see a gap between what are tricks in emerging technology messaging and buzzword noise and what's the reality. We spoke through 5 key themes as well as some concepts in terms of what's being done, what's proven successful so far, acknowledging there's a deeper conversation to be had in each and every technology market we cover about what is most effective in terms of translating to customer opportunity. And then lastly, we talked about the importance of following the competitive dollar, even if it doesn't feel like we have competitors today in quantum or we have competitors today in IoT application solutions. It's absolutely critical to get that stood up and operationalized in a way that allows organizations to track and see where the dollar is going and what that means for you. And now we'll open it up to questions. Before we do so, I just wanted to mention that today we tried to kind of incorporate a lot of the different areas we cover, quantum, IoT, 5G, digital transformation, into a broad view of what we see as that emerging technology trick or treat idea in our recommendations. But there's a whole set of specific recommendations, a whole set of specific deeper trick or treat to be had in terms of exploring each of those individual coverage areas in greater detail. It's prudent timing in that as we turn the page to 2020, we'll be releasing our typical prediction series across each of our 10 or so technology markets in which we have practices, and we'll be doing a series of webinars upcoming that will focus on really the same technology topics and the same business model and financial questions that I've summarized and highlighted here in greater detail with the analysts responsible for each of those markets. So upcoming, we have topics on management consulting, mono-cloud to multi-cloud from our cloud team, devices market disruptors, and as I mentioned previously, digital transformation. So be sure to check those out to go deeper on what we've covered today. And I know we've got a few questions already, but for the balance of the time, we're happy to open the floor up to any questions that the folks on the line may have. So we did have a question that just came in. It asks, do you have any tips on segmenting by industry? And so I think what we see in terms of research is that, or really the questions that come in, is we're hearing almost every request, whether it's what are the use cases in 5G, what's the IoT opportunity, those all come back at some level to an industry question. And so as far as tips, I think the first tip would be to always consider industry in any research program. We've done a lot of customer adoption and willingness to pay work by industry, where we're using defined kind of sample sizes around a survey of enterprise of a certain size, structuring by industry to explore these topics. I think the tip would be just to always both consider not only industry, but as I mentioned before, persona within an industry. That's where I think we've seen a lot of differences in customer journey in research. Go back to that example I gave a few moments ago about kind of IP-enabled delivery of a core enterprise software package. That engagement started with a heavy industry point of view in terms of how they were looking to understand and benchmark what competitor A versus B versus C was doing in about 7 different industries. What we saw in the findings was that it was really about who was the stakeholder and who were the participants in the room from the customer perspective in terms of consuming that technology, and what were the vast differences in how they wanted to consume that technology, how they wanted to be messaged about the benefits of that technology, and so forth. So I think certainly industry, the tips we share would have to be probably customized and specific to a particular request, whether it's or a particular market, in terms of how we might segment a research program, how we might build an industry-specific model. I know that's something our IoT team looks at around use cases, but I think I would also consider the impact of making sure that there's a buyer persona element considered, whether it's in an outbound marketing vehicle, whether it's in a financial model, whether it's in some customer adoption work as well. So that intersection of industry vertical and buyer persona, buyer role is where we see, I think, a lot of the findings coming out. Another question that came in is, are clients highly sensitive in terms of IP protection as early adopters of emerging technology solutions? I think that's probably a good question for our practice leads, because I think it would vary by whose opinion, what technology they're looking at, but generally, of course, yes. So we had a conversation, I'll give you an example, talking about a traditional set, again, of enterprise application platforms that the vendors of those platforms are looking to essentially drive customer-specific innovation opportunity, looking towards moving those platforms to more of an ML AI set of capabilities. And so there's a whole series of questions that they had for us around what's the way to structure agreements, contractual terms, guidelines to ensure IP protection around the deployment of those solutions, how it works functionally. So I think that's an area that's emerging as the technology emerges as well. There's a whole set of different implications, whether you're talking about something that's custom developed in professional services or a digital transformation that can then be incubated as an accelerator or not being incubated as an accelerator for another client, versus if you're talking enterprise applications and co-innovation for a specific client. So that's it depends, I think, is the ultimate question on who you ask, what the specifics of the opportunity is. But I think we've gotten a lot of questions as part of research programs around, as we're thinking about deploying a business model in this area, the premise of the question that comes to us from the client might be, how do we price this, or what's the right way to package our portfolio offerings? But baked into each of those studies is a series of questions around what's the right contractual terms around IP asset ownership, those sorts of things. So we do have a few minutes left. We'll leave the Q&A line open. Feel free to certainly submit additional questions as you may have them, and we're happy to answer. If you submit a question after, too, we're happy to follow up with a response as well. We do have one more question that came in. It says, are more clients opening up to shared risk and reward engagements? And that's a great question. And I think the best way to answer that is to point you to our digital transformation and insights research, which spoke to a number of customers and explored that idea of outcome-based engagements and what that architecture looks like, and who's doing it, who's not doing it, why the customers like it or not. I think the answer is that it stays where it's been, whether in an emerging technology environment or otherwise. I think a lot of the research that we do a fair amount in my team, looking at more traditional markets, as well as some emerging technology markets. What are our competitors charging? What are competitive benchmarks for consulting pricing or cybersecurity services pricing or IT deployment pricing attached to data center server storage deployments? And I think we see a lot of talk, not a lot of adoption of those agreements. But I think in digital, in that research, it's the same, but with more of a caveat or more of a mix, depending on client, depending on scenario. I think the unknowns and the challenges, there are major inhibitors there. But I'd point you to that research. Happy to kind of share excerpts from that, or get on the line with Boz and Patrick, who are our analysts leading that research, who can speak to some of the nuances. But I think my sense is we haven't seen a ton of uptick. It's been business as usual, whether you're talking traditional consultancy or digital. There's just mechanics there, challenges, inhibitors that are impacting those markets.
All right, everyone, we're reaching 2 o'clock our time, so please feel free to reach out to Bryan with any follow-up questions. If you have a few moments, it would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out the survey on your screen. A replay version of the webcast will be available after the event and will be sent out to you via email. To view a list of our upcoming and past webinars, please visit tbri.com. Be sure to join us on Wednesday, November 20th for Digital Transformation in 2020, How Hype Gets Scale and Substance. Thanks and have a great day.